Welcome back, everybody. Our next guest is a college political science professor, God bless him, a campus reform higher education fellow, and the host of the PAS podcast. At this point, I don't think there's anything that he doesn't do, but one case Nicholas Giordano has been a beacon of transparent light on are the very tactics the Biden administration uses to indoctrinate our youth and politically weaponize our higher education system. Nicholas, I am sure the majority of college students are thinking Biden is glorious for fighting to cancel student loans, but what really is going on in the education system that they should be focused on instead?
They should be focused on this radical push for diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. I mean, we just witnessed the CUNY graduate, Fatima Mohammed, come out there and blast our entire legal system as based on white supremacy. She called the NYPD a bunch of fascists, and this is at a graduation ceremony. And she alluded to anti-Semitic remarks throughout her speech. She's going to be a future lawyer. And this is what she's arguing, but she's not alone. We've seen this in graduation ceremonies throughout the United States, and Campus Reform has highlighted it. Dr. Scott Atlas was giving his graduation commencement speech, and he was met with shouts of, "Go F yourself." Now, imagine being in that audience. That should be an embarrassment to the families that came to watch their young adults. They're not children anymore. They're young adults receive their degrees. It should be a day of celebration. And yet this is the way the student body is behaving. So why are they behaving this way? Well, it's partly due to the indoctrination that's taking place on these college campuses, where we're just lumping everyone into groups, pitting the groups against each other. We're pushing this false premise of white supremacy out there. And then you have the Biden administration weaponizing higher education by providing Homeland Security grant funding to universities and institutions, where in their grant applications, they lay out how Fox News and the Republican Party, the Christian Broadcasting Network, as well as the Heritage Foundation, are the initial seeds of right-wing extremism. Turning Point USA and Prager University, they're one step below neo-Nazi organizations. So this is the radical approach that has been taken by the Biden administration and throughout academia, and it is concerning because these are the people that are going to be future leaders in law, in business, in education, in public policy, and yet look at how they conduct themselves.
Right. Well, and my concern is that this, I mean, we know that this started a long time ago because the students of 30 years ago and 20 years ago are now the ones who are weaponizing the justice system. So, of course, I've got to get your opinion on the last 24 hours, the news that President Trump has received a target notification of this investigation by Jack Smith. What are your thoughts?
Well, again, I just find it extremely interesting. When it comes to former President Trump and the investigations, everything leaks out, right? We get anonymous source after anonymous source. It's leaking like a sieve. And yet when it comes to President Biden, who's also under a special counsel investigation for classified documents, you don't hear a peep. I mean, we learned about Hunter Biden's laptop from Miranda Devine in 2020, even though the FBI had it since 2019. We learned about the FD 1023 this year, even though the FBI has had this document since 2020 and it has footnotes that refer to 2017. Here we are 6 years later. Washington, D.C. can't keep anything a secret for 6 years, and yet they are. So I think we're seeing the continued weaponization, not just of higher education, but of government institutions as well. And the Biden administration has made clear under the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism that anyone that dissents from the government narrative, the government-approved narrative, they could be expressing anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, and therefore declared as a domestic terrorist. So it's the increasing weaponization that we're seeing today. We see the double standards, but it goes beyond that. I think that the weaponization of the FBI and our bureaucratic institutions represents the greatest threat to this country.
Nicholas, I want to put on someone's pollster hat for a moment and ask you to give us just a casual poll of what you see in your classroom, because, you know, oftentimes it's the negative news that gets the most attention. It's the negative action by students. It's the segregated graduation ceremonies. It's the commencement speeches like Fatima Mohammed's. It's those types of stories get the negative attention. But when it comes down to it, in your classroom, is there maybe a little bit more diversity of thought? Is that something that we can cling to as a silver lining?
There is, and there's actually hope, because in my classroom, and I think in community colleges in general, the student body isn't as ideological. as maybe a four-year university system where they're all have similar backgrounds and they belong in a bubble together. Where at a community college, you have people that actually have real world life problems or challenges that they're facing. Some of them have children, some of them are taking care of elderly adults. Many of them are working, and a lot of them are working full time. And so they have to juggle. So they understand what the real world is about. And so it is different. The diversity opinion in my classrooms, it seems like it's almost evenly split, 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% they just don't care about anything. And they're probably the happiest people out of everyone. So it is a little bit different. But the interesting thing, a Gallup poll was released today that showed social conservatism has actually increased. There are more people that are socially conservative today, according to this Gallup poll, than in previous years. And I found that really interesting because a lot of times we hear that the country is economically conservative, but socially it's liberal. But it appears that all this push for diversity, equity, and inclusion, the whole gender ideology push, it's actually moving more and more people, including young adults, towards conservatism.
Yeah, well, I think that for people who are socially liberal and libertarian, we've all seen the fruits of that, and it hasn't been too nice, especially right now in Pride Month and seeing what has happened at a lot of those events. I want to ask you very quickly, we don't have time to play this clip, but BlackRock CEO Larry Fink was talking in a speech about having to force things on companies, force ideologies, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these types of values on businesses. And I'm actually long on this. I'm actually very positive because I think when you look at companies like Bud Light and Target and they see that they have been on the receiving end of people's wrath when it comes to this type of garbage, Silicon Valley Bank having, checking off lots of boxes on their executive board, but not a risk manager. And I just have to think that for companies who might want to go to BlackRock for investments, I would think that they would rather have customers and income than debt. Does that make sense to you?
It certainly does. And I think with Larry Fink and BlackRock, while he did say that, essentially we're going to try and get companies to do our bidding, really it's about the consumer, right? They want to socially engineer this society on a grand scale, something that we've never witnessed to this level before. And it's all about social engineering. Yeah. But the consumers are pushing back. And sooner or later, the corporate boards are going to realize that the consumer's the ones with the real dollar. And if they don't get out of politics, they're going to hurt themselves.
That's right. And it's been glorious to see the backlash. It's now called the Bud Light effect. Talk about that for a colloquialism. Nicholas Giordano, thank you, sir. We'll be right back after these commercials.